and get started. CI/CD, it's a culture shift. There's a lot of things that you think about with CI/CD, but the thing that we're going to focus on today is the culture shift and the things that you have to do to be successful when adopting and moving towards embracing CI/CD. So my name is James Q Quick. My middle name is Quentin, so I kind of embrace the two Qs. Not many people have two Qs as their initials. If you're interested in finding me on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, James Q Quick. A little bit about me. After I graduated with my computer science degree, joined Microsoft on the evangelism team in South Florida and New York City for about 3 years total. Did a lot of this type of thing, a lot of conference speaking, a lot of presentations, a lot of working with people in the community to teach them how to use Microsoft tools. About 3 years into that, I ended up moving back home to Memphis, which is where I'm from, and started working at FedEx. I had interned there in college. I started as a developer doing front-end, back-end, full stack, doing Angular on the front end, and then mainly Java, Spring Boot, microservice stuff on the back end. About a year ago, got promoted to an application architect. I still do a lot of development, but I do a little bit more of like the architecture work of trying to, in my organization, try to help facilitate modernizing a lot of the applications that we have. That's really kind of the space that I fit in. So when I think about myself, I've really developed these 3 simple words that kind of describe me in this scenario. So first and foremost is developer. Been doing that for several years. Like I said, even as an architect, I still do a lot of development, and that's something that I wanted to do. Speaker, obviously doing this kind of thing. I did a lot of that with Microsoft. Really enjoy being in front of people, being with people, teaching, all that kind of stuff. And the last part is, in fact, teaching. So a little bit of a fun fact. I run a YouTube channel called Learn, Build, Teach, which is focused on web development, and then also have a couple of Udemy courses, so I really am trying to get back into the online content world, and now this year really making a big push to get out and do more conference talks, which is why I'm here today. Also started teaching a boot camp in Memphis that just started up a few months ago, and it was kind of funny. I was telling my wife I was really excited about this talk. It was the first time that I'd given a talk in like 8 months, and she was like, well, you give a talk every Monday and Wednesday, because I get in front of a big class and do my lecture in front of a class every Monday and Wednesday, so I guess it's not that new. Anyway, excited to be here. So here's how this is going to go. We won't be focusing on specific tech choices. We're not going to talk about languages. We're not going to talk about build servers. We're not going to talk about specific frameworks. We're not going to talk about specific technologies or tools. What we will focus on is principles and cultural expectations that you need to be prepared for on your way to adopting and embracing and taking advantage of the good things that come with CI/CD. We will focus on some real-world examples. So in my last couple of years at FedEx, I enjoy being kind of on the modern edge of development, which I assume a lot of people here do as well, and that's why you're here. So I've kind of put myself in the position to try to lead some of the initiatives that we have going on, including adopting CI/CD. So I'm going to share some of my personal experiences over the course of the last 2 years, working on a couple of different projects, the things that we've learned, and all that kind of stuff. And lastly, hopefully, and I think I've timed this out relatively well, hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. We should go about 50 minutes, and then we've got some questions that are coming through, potentially in Slack, that we'll cover at the end of the session. So how many people watch stand-up comedy? Handful of hands. Anyone ever heard of Bert Kreischer? Yeah, The Machine. So first of all, if you haven't seen The Machine skit, go and watch that on YouTube. Second of all, Bert Kreischer has a show on Netflix, not a show, but a stand-up, called Storytime. And I thought it was really cool how he'll kind of tell these jokes, and he'll just pivot and say Storytime, and he'll switch into a story. So that's going to be how I kind of pivot here into the real-world example. So I'll kind of talk through some generic things and then flip into story time and share some personal experiences, again, the things that I've learned in the past couple of years from what we've been doing. If you haven't seen The Machine, go and look it up. You'll be hopefully pleasantly surprised. It is fairly crude, so if you're not into that sort of thing, you might avoid it. But all right, so one of the first things we need to do is address really what is CI/CD. This is one of those things that I think a lot of people talk about, especially a lot of management talks about, without fully understanding what it really means, without understanding what all goes into it, and really understanding what the benefits are. So this first section is going to be defining what CI/CD is, and then a couple things about the value that it produces. And for what it's worth, these definitions came from AWS, Amazon's cloud platform. I thought they had some pretty good definitions as to what these words mean. The first one is continuous integration, so software development practice where developers regularly merge their code changes into a central repository, after which automated builds and tests are run. And there's several words in here that are highlighted in bold that I think are most important, and the first one is practice. Again, it's not talking about a specific set of tools. It's not telling you which language you need to use. It's not telling you which build server or deployment mechanism you need to use. It's not telling you any of that. It's telling you that it's a practice. Practice where you regularly merge changes into a central repository. First off, how many people are using source control? If you didn't raise your hand, hang around after we'll have a talk, because you should be if you haven't or if you're not. So regularly merging changes into a central repository means you check in frequently to see how your code matches up with everyone else's code that's also working on that project. The last part of this is automated builds and tests. You'll see this over and over again throughout the talk, are run when that code is pushed. So the idea is when you make code changes, you check those in, you have your tests run, and you really quickly see how your code integrates with the code from everyone else. This is going to help improve developer efficiency, productivity, find bugs quicker, deliver updates quicker, and it's very, very important in a CI/CD world that you know where you stand in terms of the code that you put out there versus the code that other people are putting out there and how they work together. Next part is continuous delivery or deployment, depending on how you take it exactly. Software development practice, where code changes are automatically built and tested and prepared for release to production. It expands upon continuous integration by deploying all code changes to a testing environment and/or production environment after the build stage. So a couple of more key points or key words here. Practice again, right? We're seeing that it's not a specific set of tools that you have to use. It's an idea, it's a practice thing that you need to follow. Automatic builds and tests, you see that again. And then what it's saying here is you get some sort of deployable asset out of that build. After you do a build, now you've got some sort of deployable asset that you can take to a development server, you can take to production, but you don't necessarily have to. So the delivery aspect is through every build, you get a deployable artifact or asset. The deployment part is you automatically deploy that somewhere. Then there's a little bit more generic idea of DevOps, and I kind of think of this as kind of the umbrella that CI/CD falls into, and it's the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that increases an organization's ability to deliver applications and services at high velocity. So notice out of the four first selected bolded words, cultural philosophies, practices, those first three, again, that's not anything about how you do this specifically. It's not anything about a tool that you use. It's not a language. It's not a framework. It's a cultural philosophy and a practice. And I think this is the thing that I've learned is culturally, the change that comes with adopting CI/CD and really taking advantage of it is the hardest part. Everybody can learn tech. Everybody can learn a new language. Everybody can do those things. Embracing the cultural aspects of this is incredibly hard. The end goal of DevOps is high velocity. It's being able to provide value quickly to your users when they ask for it. It's being able to adapt to change. It's being able to push out updates and stuff quickly. That's going to be a theme, obviously, throughout the stuff that we talk about. So here's a couple questions to ask yourself, just kind of thinking about CI/CD. Do you have the ability to respond to change? Do you care? Do you really know why that's important? Do you know why it's important to be able to respond quickly to change? Do you have a good understanding of the things that are going on around you technically, things that are going on around you based on your users, your customers, things they're looking for? Do you understand why responding to change quickly is important? How do you know your code works? Going back to continuous integration, when you check in code, how do you know that it works? Do you feel good about your code? How many people write code that never messes up? Usually there's a couple like bold hands and they're like, yeah, I don't ever mess up. So if it doesn't work, can you quickly find out that it didn't? So running these automated tests, when you push code to a central repository, automated tests are running, you get feedback to let you know, did your code work or not? You can find that out quickly. Then how about pushes to production? How many people are a little uneasy when you push code to production? Probably more hands there. There's actually not as many as I expected, so this is a room full of talented developers. Typically, the feeling is when you go to production, you're a little bit on edge, right? You've been doing your work, you push it out there, and you just kind of sit and wait and hope that things happen the way you think they will. So first story time, talking about source control. I spent my first year and a half, I think, working with a developer who was one of the best developers I'd ever been around, super, super knowledgeable, always was really adamant about best practices, always knew exactly this is exactly what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it because that's the best way. And that was good for a lot of things, but one of the things that we really differed on and actually really brought us down was the idea of checking into source control and how often you do that. So we were working on this new GUI page where I was working on the front end, he was working on the back end, and we started out by kind of saying, like, this is what the API is going to be. He kind of explained to me, this is what you can expect. I said, all right, well, I'll expect that, and I'll go and build based on that. Try to have further conversations. He didn't want to check in code to source control, to the central repository, because he didn't want to check in broken code and then mess up my stuff or anyone else's stuff. So that was his big fear. So we would go 2 weeks with me working on the front end, him working on the back end, him not checking code, and then in 2 weeks, I would expect the API to be the way we talked about 2 weeks ago, but things had changed, right? So his API changed just a little bit enough to where I had to go back and refactor some code to meet the new API. So we got to integrate after 2 weeks. Then we took kind of another 2-week break and expected additional APIs or the same consistent APIs, and those had changed again. He changed them for understandable reasons. He found a better way to do it. He refactored, all this kind of stuff. But like I didn't know that for 2 entire weeks. That's not continuous integration. Continuous integration is even if you end up breaking something, you check it in so that you can find out quicker. Also, when you go 2 weeks without checking in code, integration at that point becomes a lot more difficult than it does if you check in code every day. So this is something where culturally, one of the best developers I've ever been around was not prepared to change the way that he wrote and maintained code to really adopt CI/CD practices. So here's a hypothetical scenario. Let's say someone asks you for a new feature. Wants you to add a new link to get access to go to a different page basically on a website. So if you're a web developer, making this change is adding an anchor tag with an href to say which website to go to. This is super, super quick and easy. Can you provide that value or feature quickly? If someone were to come to you today in your business or your company where you work as a developer, and they asked you to do that, could you not only code it, but actually provide that value to them so that they could use it quickly? To answer that question, you have to think about, do you have the pipes? Do you have the pipeline set up? Do you have the things necessary to actually take that code that you just wrote and put it out there and feel good about it working? If you do have the pipes, or if you do or don't, depending on the scenario, how long does it take you to respond to a request like that? If it's a short change, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, something like that, something you can do in a day, how long does it then take you to provide that value to the users? A day, a week, a month, a year? So I thought just kind of sticking with the Mario theme, this was kind of cool. It lists out the different Mario games, when they came out, and you can kind of look at the difference in years in between different versions of Mario. So they started out with the first one, had a gap of 4 years, then 2, then 1, and then kind of starting there, they do 5, 5, 4, and then starting in 2006, they go 1 year, 2 year, 1 year. So I don't know the specifics of what's going on behind the development process there. I don't know all those details, but I can guarantee you that they work to find a way to provide new games based on user feedback to make a better game every year, every couple years, by improving their development practices. Whether or not it was specific things that fall into the category of CI/CD, I don't know, but they improve their process in some way to be able to provide value back to the user quickly. How many people play Mario? Several hands. What are big games? Sports games come out every year. Mario, I'm a big Halo guy myself. If whatever your favorite game is, if they came out with a new game every year, would you buy it? Non-rhetorical question. Laughs, no yeses or no. Still non-rhetorical question. Yes. All right. So people love these games. They're looking for a new version of the game almost every year. Right? That's a change from where they were 20 years ago, where they came out with a new game every couple of years, and they had a couple that were shorter time frames. But you can bet that they learned how to increase their throughput and provide value back to customers quicker along the way. So let's talk about a fear of a move to production. Talked about moving code to production. Usually there's a little bit of uneasiness. And this, I didn't specify this, but this is kind of especially fear of an MTP on Friday. How many people have heard the golden rule of don't move code to production on Friday? Right? Why? Well, There's so much that can go wrong, right? Calls on the weekend, no thanks. No one wants to get called for support on the weekend, although I don't know why I guess it's slightly better than getting called throughout the week, or slightly worse. But no one wants to get called in general, especially not on the weekends. And then on a Friday, you're like, I'm really ready to go home. Usually on Friday, we leave a little bit early. I don't want to sacrifice that time. So no code to production unless you're this guy. So when you deploy to production, do it on Friday afternoon. And this is kind of actually, as ironic as this is, CI/CD, really embracing CI/CD and taking advantage of it means you can push code to production on a Friday and not freak out like you typically would. That golden rule can change if your pipelines are really good and your tests are really good, that you know if your code goes to production, most likely it's going to be good. Even with good pipelines, you might still be a little hesitant, but you feel a lot better than you did before. So here's another story time. At work, got a request to, and this wasn't the specific request, but something like this, but got a request to add a button to do X, whatever X was. Got the request for this new button. This took about 15 minutes of development time, literally 15 minutes. But we weren't able to provide that value back to the user for 2 weeks. And the reason was at that point, we didn't have a lot of automated stuff set up. We also had a move to production scheduled for 2 weeks in the future with a big set of releases. Sorry. We just figured we would take the small change and lump it into those set of changes that were going to production in 2 weeks. If we're already doing a move to production, this thing wasn't that critical, it can wait 2 weeks. It seems reasonable. Again, it wasn't a critical thing, but the fact that I can spend 15 minutes developing a feature that someone's asking for, but yet they have to wait 2 weeks to take advantage of that is insane. The amount of time it takes just to get it out there is 2 weeks versus 15 minutes. So here's an example of amazing agility. How many web developers do we have in the room? Good amount of hands. How many people are using Visual Studio Code? Good amount of hands as well. So VS Code, I was actually at Microsoft when they released VS Code. I wasn't a web developer then. I kind of got into it right after that. But VS Code came out 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. And it's quickly become this is personal opinion, but I think a lot of people agree, the best editor for web development and probably the most popular editor for web development in only a couple of years. Atom and Sublime and Notepad++ and all those ones had been out for a while. VS Code basically came out of nowhere and took the development community by storm. So here's a couple of things, or the thing is specifically that they do so well is they've got 2 different editions. One is the stable edition, the blue one on the left. One is the Insiders edition on the right. The stable edition comes out with new features, new releases every month. So here's an example of what the March release was. So every single month they put out a new release, and it's got really good features in it, and they're like directly coming from issues and requests from their GitHub repository. So that's every month. They also have an Insiders edition, which gets a build every night. And this is features that they're currently working on, but they don't guarantee that they will work. These are things that are unstable or in beta, whatever it is that they call it. But they ship code for the Insiders edition every single night. I personally use the Insiders edition myself. Anybody else use the Insiders edition? No brave souls. For what it's worth, from my experience, from other people I've talked to, I've never really come across something that went wrong with the Insiders edition. So they're releasing code every single night, and I've never seen something break in production. But in an agile world, if something were to break, that's only better learning for them and quicker learning for them to turn around and make that thing better in the future. So let's talk agility. Talk about agility, usually we think of agile. How many people practice agile at work? Talk about agile, we talk about agility. It's not just a scrum. It's not just a planning board. It's not just sprints. You can do all of those things and not really get the benefits of agile. I think a lot of people fall into the category of, like, I'm doing the things that it tells me to without really thinking about the long-term goals and what value is supposed to come out of that. So thinking about agility, before you answer that, here's a couple things to consider. Your people structure. We'll talk about this more later on, but is your people structure set up to support agility? One of the examples of that is bottlenecks. Anyone ever had a dependency on another team and that wasn't their priority, so you get held back? A couple hands. So if I've got a dependency on someone else to do something and that's not their priority and they have no reason to do it, that's going to hold me back. That means somewhere along the line, the people structure, the organization around teams is not set up correctly to support agility. We'll talk about this more in a little bit. Infrastructure and resources. Infrastructure, databases, cloud spaces, virtual machines, all these different things that we need infrastructure-wise, build servers, testing deployments or testing areas, all that kind of stuff that we need. Do you have that available to do CI/CD? Because you need a lot of it. And process, paperwork, approvals, things that you have to do to be able to do the things that you know are right, but you have to go through hoops to do them first. So here's an example of approvals for MTP, move to production, and a couple questions. How many approvals does it take for you to move code to production? How many people do you need to sign off on that to move your code to production? Whose approvals do you need? And here's the most important question, and probably the most controversial, is are those really the right people? A lot of times you get in a situation where to move code to production, you need approval from a director or VP. Any directors or VPs in here before I do this? One? All right. You can yell at me later if you want. If you need an approval from a director or VP at that level, that's not the person to be approving stuff going to production. The best person to know whether or not code is ready to go to production is the developer, the development lead, or the development team, or some combination. They work on the code every single day. They know the code that's already out there. They can go and look at the code that's out there by going through source control and doing diffs and comparisons and all that kind of stuff. They know the features they're working on. They know the possible things that could go wrong. They know best whether or not code should be ready to go to production. Now, to clarify just a little bit, maybe not every developer, maybe development leads, right, should kind of have that responsibility. But a VP and a director having their approval doesn't mean anything. There might be a scenario where, as a developer, I say, hey, you know, I don't feel comfortable making this decision. Here's the options. Here's the potential positive and the potential negative. Pass that decision on. But if you've got a developer that you trust to do their job, they know the code intimately, they work with it every single day, that person is the person that knows best whether or not code should go to production. So I took this training on CI/CD a year and a half ago or so, and one of the big things they talked about was trust. And this is the theme with trusting your developers to do their job. How many times as a developer have you felt handcuffed to not be able to do the things that you know you should be able to do? Like every single day for me. So process, paperwork, getting someone else's approval when you're the right person to make that approval doesn't really make sense. But culturally, that's a hard thing to change. That's a hard thing for upper management to say, all right, yeah, you're good, I trust you. I instill that trust in you. And here's the even harder thing is if you put that trust in a developer and something does go wrong, you have to still trust that they made the right decision at the time. Things can go wrong and they go wrong now, but you have to trust your developers and your development teams to do the things that they need to do to get the job done. And again, to clarify, this is probably more of a development lead to make the final approval, but your development team as a whole is the one that knows best. So let's talk about waterfall for a minute. How many people are doing waterfall? Only a couple. So a lot of people have kind of moved on to agile, which I think we talked about earlier. So here's the thing with kind of giving the agile pitch. If you give an agile pitch, most people will give the pitch and say, like, waterfall sucks. Agile is perfect. Agile gives you everything you need. Agile, blah, blah, blah. I'm never that person. I'm always, like, I can see positive and negative on both sides. So here's one of the things about waterfall is you spend however many months getting all the requirements for a project, right? So a business team gets developer with a development team. They come up with requirements, and they have all the requirements that you need, and then you take 6 months or a year or 2 years to build that out. Now, here's the downside. The downside is in 2 years, you have no idea if the requirements that you came up with 2 years ago make any sense now. You have no idea if your customers still want that thing or those specific features. Here's the upside. Here's the benefit of waterfall. As a developer, if I have all of the requirements in front of me, I don't have any guesswork. And I've personally experienced this now, practicing agile, where it was very difficult because we didn't have requirements and we're kind of going on the seat of our pants every single day trying to figure out what we're doing. Waterfall gives you that clarity up front. Downside is you don't have the ability to change and you don't have the flexibility to handle things out there, different requests, and all that kind of stuff. So here's an alternative. This is basically agile, but a little bit maybe differently worded. And this is something I talked a lot about at Microsoft, which is the lean startup approach. So it's 3 things: build, measure, learn. And you start with building something. Whatever it is, you start with an MVP, minimum viable product, which is one of the hardest things for people to do. How many people think it's easy to just like, oh, we could use these couple features, but we'll go ahead and release before that? How many people are comfortable not doing all the features that they want to do at first? Only a couple of people. Cutting out those features and sticking to an MVP is incredibly difficult, but it's super important because after you build that MVP, after you build something, you go into the measure phase and you get feedback from users, you get feedback from people, you see how things go, you take that feedback, you go into the learn phase, you figure out, all right, based on that feedback, this is what we need to do. We need to fix this one feature, add a new feature. You go back in the build phase and you continue that cycle. This gives you agility and ability to change and provide value back to your users quickly. Waterfall does not. Again, waterfall has its advantages, and that's why it worked for so long, but waterfall does not give you that. So if you believe that agility and ability to respond to change is important, waterfall does not give you that. So you need the ability to change when change is the only constant. In the technological world that we live in the consumer base that we live in, everything constantly changes. You have to be able to respond to it. So let's talk about management for a minute, and management/upper management. So with me personally, with my architecture role, where I fit in is I kind of think of myself as the middleman between developers, the people, and upper management to try to bridge the gap in communication. Developers and upper management speak totally different languages, and often those, whatever they say to each other gets miscommunicated. And I've seen this happen over and over again, and it's always a sense of like us versus them. How many people have ever felt, I don't know if you may not do this when this is being recorded, but it's an us versus them mentality sometimes, right? Like developers, we the people kind of thing. So I wanted to be the middleman between that and try to clear up that communication or miscommunication. So think about when you talk about CI/CD, if you're talking about doing CI/CD at your company or the place that you work, does upper management get it? And before you answer that question, here's a couple questions to ask yourself. Will they change the process? So we just talked about getting approvals from directors and VPs. We talked about paperwork and all these different things which have their place, and a lot of it needs to be done, even in an agile world. But is upper management willing to adopt CI/CD to the point where they change the existing process? Are they willing to change the things that have been done for this way for 10 or 15 years because now we're in a new modern era of development? Will they instill trust in your teams? We talked about taking away the need for a director or VP to approve a code change. Will they be able and comfortable to instill trust in their developers? And then do they understand the process? And here's what I mean by that. Do they understand the long-term effects? Mostly they do, because someone came in and gave a pitch that says long-term effects are you can release code to production quicker, you can have all these automated tests and never have to have errors when you move to production because it's a pipeline and it's scripted and all this kind of stuff. That's an easy sell, right? The benefits of Agile and CI/CD, I don't think many people have a problem with. What they don't get is the short-term effects. There's a really big difference between short-term and long-term effects when adopting anything, especially CI/CD. So in this case, your short-term effects, like this, it kind of starts off really low. You might even see a dip. Your productivity, the things that you're able to produce in the short term while you're learning and adopting all of these cultural things and practices and technologies, your productivity goes down initially. That's a hard thing to understand when you get a pitch about what CI/CD will give you long term. It's hard to understand the short-term effects. So you go through this phase of short-term learning and building and all this kind of stuff to then eventually get to the exponential growth and the things that people promised you with CI/CD. So the most important thing is that you understand that first, however long it is, there's no tangible possible result. All it is leading to that exponential result that comes later on. So a couple of additional questions to ask yourself. For upper management, are they prepared to take the hit now? Are they prepared to understand that productivity goes down now for a while to then reap the benefits of CI/CD and Agile later on? And do they really want to change the way things are done to get there? Talked about process, talked about approvals, all those different things. Are they really going to change the way things are done to get there? So in this, talk about timelines. How many people as a developer have ever been asked for an estimate on a project? How many people feel comfortable giving that response? How many people refuse to give estimates because it doesn't mean anything? There we go. A couple chuckles. So timelines, in the past with waterfall, you had a timeline, which was still arbitrary, because you have no idea how long something's going to take. But it was structured that way. You were supposed to structure it based on 6 months or a year, 2 years to finish a project, right? And Agile and CI/CD in a CI/CD world, that's not a thing. You're going day by day and week by week to respond to things that come in and respond to changes and handle those and give feedback and value back to the user as quickly as possible. So story time, we had a project that started out one of the more modern projects to embrace a lot of the architecture that we were working on, CI/CD, pipelines, automated testing, that kind of stuff. And originally, a team member, and he'll get a kick out of this when he watches this later on YouTube, he was asked for a timeline, and he gave a timeline based on the things that he knew at the time. So we get a little bit closer to like that timeline. And he started to communicate like there's more going on than we thought. There's a lot more that we have to do, which he was absolutely justified in saying. There was a ton more going on in terms of the things that we had to learn to be able to really do CI/CD, which is what people preach about. He started to communicate that and got a little pushback. That's one of my biggest pet peeves. If you ask me for an estimate, that does not become a deadline. An estimate is an estimate, and in an agile world, things change every single day, and because of those things changing, we have to change what we do and how we do it. That estimate does not become a timeline or a deadline. It is an estimate, and we the people, the developers, upper management, everyone has to get that. That's a hard thing to sell culturally. That's a hard thing for a VP to go to an SVP and CEO and say, yeah, we don't know when it's going to be done, but we're sure going to try really hard. That's a hard thing to do. You've probably phrased it a little bit different. That's why I'm not a VP right now. But that's a hard thing to do. Oh, I was like, there's no words on this. That's because I was supposed to have already flipped to that slide, so I apologize. Team structure. We talked about this a little bit. Do you have the team structure in place to support agility? Do you have your teams have a similar set of priorities so that if I have a dependency on another team, there's no bottleneck. I don't have to wait for them. They've got that same priority so that we can both move on together. Another thing is, and we'll talk about this later on, is do you have a team of people that can start to lead the path for CI/CD? Not every developer in your organization can take the time to learn and adopt these new things. You don't have the time to do that for everyone. So do you have a person or a set of people or a team that can push forward and kind of break into this new world of CI/CD? Now with that, one of the really hard things is if I'm one of those people and the expectations of me is to go forward and push the envelope and to learn those new things, I can't have someone pulling me back here every single day for a production problem or asking me to add a new feature to an existing application. How many people have been in that position before? About half of the hands. You have to be able to, if you want people to go ahead and do these things that you preach about, you have to be able to protect them from outside tugging and pulling. They have to be able to go and do the things that you ask them to do. So the last question on this management section is, will they fight? Will they fight to do things the right way? Will they fight to understand and communicate? We're going to have this negative productivity for a while, tangible, what's the best way to phrase this? It's not tangibly positive, so it's kind of a negative productivity, but the productivity comes with the long term because then you get that exponential growth. Are they prepared to fight that? Are they prepared to change the process? Are they prepared to set up the teams and change the way things have been done for so long to really embrace CI/CD to gain those benefits? So the flip side of this, and I'm not going to be the person who just like preaches at upper management, now it comes down to me, us, we, the team, the developers, the BAs, the people who are doing that work. So here's something to think about is, does your team get it? Does your team really understand what's going on? Before you answer that question, questions to ask yourself, are you prepared to adopt new process? How many people love everything you do changing every single day so that you can never know what's going on? That's an exaggeration, but you're potentially about to jump into that world where you're learning something new every single day. As a developer, when you say, yeah, I want to do CI/CD, are you prepared to do that? Are you prepared to handle the responsibility of trust? If a VP says, all right, I do trust you to do your job, are you prepared to handle that responsibility? That's not nothing. That's some pressure, right? Now, depending on who that person is who granted you that trust, what I want to gauge is if something does go wrong, that they really believe that I did the right thing at the time. Nothing is ever perfect, so if someone's going to trust me, they have to trust me when it goes wrong too. As a developer, that might be something you think about if you're put in a position of trust. Are you able to stick up for yourself? Are you able to communicate, look, you wanted to do this CI/CD stuff? I'm telling you, it's going to go downhill for a while before we go back up. Are you strong enough to communicate that and stand up for yourself to say, I need more time to do this because this is what you said was important? And are you prepared to learn a lot? Again, all these different things that are involved in CI/CD, that's when you get into the specifics and the tools and also the practices and the cultural parts. Are you prepared to learn a lot? Are you prepared to change the way that you write code? Talked about the developer that I worked on, one of the best developers and most knowledgeable developers I've ever been around. He wasn't prepared to change the way that he wrote and maintained code, which drastically would hold me and the team back in a CI/CD world. And then the way you work as a team. Most people in here, I think, are already doing Agile, so that's not as much of a conversation, but the way you work together changes a little bit. And at the end of the day, we, the company, need you. We need everyone to buy in. We need everyone to do their part. We need everyone to do the things that we say are important to meet CI/CD. Culturally, there's a lot of changes on both sides. The developers, the development teams, the BAs, the teams, upper management. There's a lot of work on both sides to understand where we're going and how we get there. So let's talk about resources. Hardware is one thing. Whether you're in a data center, your own data center, someone else's data center, whether you're in the cloud, you're going to need that hardware. Whether or not you own the hardware doesn't matter. You need hardware to support all the different servers, all the different VMs, all the different databases, all the different build servers, test servers, production servers. You need stuff for that. If you don't have the ability to get that stuff now, you've got to figure out how you're going to get it. Next is time, and this is something that I'll continue to talk about over and over again, is short-term versus long-term. Does everyone involved understand the difference between the short-term and the long-term effects of CI/CD? Short-term is negative. To someone else, short-term sucks. There's nothing tangible that you can go to someone and say, that was good. You can say, oh, I learned this stuff. Nah. They want to see, for the most part, did you provide value or did you earn us money? Right? Short-term, no. Long-term, definitely. But everyone has to understand the difference between short-term and long-term. People, do you have the people structure? Again, do you have the team set up correctly? Do you have the team set up to practice Agile? Are they trained in Agile? Do they understand what's going on? Are they prepared to have the same priorities to work together going forward so that there's no bottlenecks? And then for people, we talked about like the tugging. Like if my job is to go forward and learn all this new stuff, I can't have people tugging me all the time. You got to think about, do you have either the ability for someone else to cover that work and free me up, or hire someone to cover that work and free me up, or hire someone to do the new stuff while I do the old stuff? That's hard. How many people can go hire 100 developers right now? 0 hands. You have to find that balance. You have to be able to protect the people that are going forward and doing this new stuff. Training. This is something that I'm very, very passionate about. I spend a lot of my time doing online training for people. I've done in-person workshops, and I'm just constantly preaching in my organization that training is super, super important. Not only for me to invest in myself and my skills, but the team to invest in their skills going forward so that we can help do more stuff. Training can take place in a lot of different forms. It can be you bring in a third-party vendor to do a hands-on training. You could do someone on your team, or if you have that team that's kind of led the initiative for something like CI/CD, you could have them do a training for the rest of the people. How many people do YouTube videos for learning? What about Udemy courses? I'm literally a web developer because of YouTube and Udemy. You can literally learn anything you want to on YouTube, and then you can find some paid content on Udemy that can go a little deeper. That's an option as well. Whatever the best format is for this training, understand that people need training to adopt all these different things. And the last one that all of these things takes is the simple one, is money. Do you have money if you're going to a third-party cloud? Do you have money to pay for all the VMs and things that are out there in that third-party cloud, all the different servers, database servers? Do you have money to pay for training? Do you have money to fly someone in to do a training for your team? Do you have money to hire new people so that I stop getting tugged on and they can take care of that work, or vice versa? Do you have money to hire people to do the new stuff so I can take care of the old stuff? Everything that we talk about comes back to money. And you got to understand, short term, you invest a lot of money before you start seeing the long-term positive effects. Testing. This is, mentioned it obviously several times already, this is probably one of the hardest things to do, culturally and technically, if you haven't done it before, if you're new to it. And it's one of the most underrated aspects of CI/CD because if your testing isn't there, CI/CD falls apart. CI/CD didn't do anything for you if you don't have good tests in place. So how many people actually do tests now, automated tests? About a third, maybe. All right. So here's the thing. Testing is hard. Coming from a developer's perspective and never really being a tester, testing is hard. There's so much to learn. You have to learn new testing frameworks. Then you have to learn how to write a test. Then you have to learn how to automate those tests. And lastly, you have to learn how to write good tests. Tests don't mean anything. Good tests do. There was I think it was Izzy this morning who had like a controversial talk about comments. Anybody go see that this morning? Fabulous talk, interactive, super, super cool. And she talked about code coverage where like that's her least favorite thing in the entire world is code coverage. And she showed that you can fake code coverage. She had tests that didn't test anything. They were just hard-coded to return true, so they passed and got 100% code coverage. This is one of the things that she, again, said was her least favorite things in the world and was very adamant about it. And for the most part, I think that's definitely really true. So tests don't mean anything. Writing good tests do, and writing good tests is hard. Putting your mindset, if you're just a developer, not in a negative way, but if you're just a developer and don't really have that testing mindset, that could be a very hard thing to transition to. Consistency is key. Tests have to be written for each new piece of code. Tests should have some sort of acceptance criteria to know whether or not the test passed, to whether or not they do the things that they're supposed to do. And everyone needs to participate. Overall, tests have to be a priority, or else your pipelines and your CI/CD stuff that you preach about doesn't do its job. Tests have to be a priority. And then you get in a scenario where you say, oh, what if they don't work, your tests? Well, you just turn them off, right? Then you can continue your pipeline or whatever because your test didn't work. Absolutely wrong. If your tests are broken, either there's something wrong, if your tests fail, either there's something wrong with your code or there's something wrong with your test. Somebody's saying it for me over here. Either there's something wrong with your code or there's something wrong with your test. Either way, that's a priority to fix. If you're used to seeing failed tests because they don't mean anything and you accept that, then when a real failed test comes along, you ignore that too and then something goes wrong. So overall with tests, you have to learn how to slow down because every piece of development you do now takes you maybe not twice as long, but longer than it did before because you have to write tests. So TDD, test-driven development, is kind of the extreme there where you write your tests first, then you code it to make sure those tests pass. In theory, to me, that sounds really good. Culturally, that's so hard. And if someone told me I had to do that every time I wrote a piece of code, I would really struggle. Regardless of how you do it, every new piece of code that you write now comes with some sort of test. And that means that your development process slows down. So let's go back to that example where I had a request come in that took 15 minutes to code, took us 2 weeks to get that out to production. If instead of 15 minutes, that development time took me 45 minutes to write the corresponding test, and I was in a true CI/CD world and I can get that code pushed out in 2 hours, or probably less, you got to look at that 2 hours versus that 2 weeks. That's the difference. So a couple of story times here. For me, it all started with a sprained ankle, really, really bad sprained ankle. We have a group at FedEx that we play basketball together. I went up for a shot, I came down, I landed on someone's foot and sprained the mess out of my ankle, really bad. I was in a boot on crutches, so I couldn't put any weight on my foot for 2 weeks. Worked from home for 2 weeks, which my manager was not that excited about, but it worked out. During that 2 weeks, I decided I was going to look into testing. I'd never done automated tests before, I'd never done unit tests before. Working on an Angular project, just figured that was a good thing that we needed to get to. And now that I'm at home with no distractions, I could really dive in and do that. Spent 2 weeks doing that, learned how to test along at the same time as actually writing tests for an application, and got, I would say, a pretty good amount of coverage for that application in 2 weeks. But if you think about time perspective, that's 2 weeks for one developer, and the most expensive resource that you have in your company is the developer's time. So everyone has to understand testing is hard, and it takes dedicated time to learn how to test and then to write the test. Another story time is my team took a week, and this was a group of 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that. We got a group of those people, took them out of the regular work environment to a different building on a different campus in a room isolated by ourselves just to go through and try to learn how to test and then fill in gaps for tests that we didn't have, which we didn't have much at all. Even with that week of 5 or 6 developers' time, we only got a small section of the amount of tests that we really wanted and needed. So understand that testing is hard and it takes time, and it's one of the most underrated aspects of CI/CD. How many people have heard of the swarm in a CI/CD world? So in CI/CD, every pipeline issue you have, if a test fails, if a delivery, if you're like delivering an artifact fails, building fails, every pipeline issue is a production problem. I thought that was pretty cool. Every pipeline issue that happens is a production problem. You have to stop everything you're doing and fix that problem because it is a production problem. Your production is dependent upon that pipeline, and if it doesn't work, you can't provide value to your users. So what about alerts? How do you know when things go wrong? If you get an alert, that's something you need to have set up so that immediately when that thing goes wrong, you can go out there and try to respond to it. Now, here's the thing, same as failed tests earlier. If you set up your alerts wrong and you start to ignore them, either there's something wrong with your alerts. I don't know, what's the other half of that? Or there's something wrong with you. Can you finish it for me? I don't know. There's something wrong with your alerts. If your alerts don't mean anything to you, you've got the wrong alert, or you don't need the alert at all. When an alert comes through, it should mean something, and that means you go and fix whatever that thing is. Story time. With an application that we have recently, we set up alerts. Coworkers will get a kick out of this as well. A lot of alerts came through really quickly over the course of the couple days. I looked around the office. No one was freaking out. Obviously, those alerts don't mean much, so I went to sleep. Not to sleep, but I ignored those alerts, right? Those alerts were wrong. It's not just, you cannot have the mentality of starting to ignore them, or it's the boy who cried wolf, where later on you don't believe it. Alerts and failed tests and failed pipeline issues mean something, and if they don't, you're doing it wrong. So a couple questions to ask yourself. Are you prepared to immediately swarm issues? When something comes up, does everyone understand you stop what you're doing and handle that problem? Culturally, that's hard. That's hard to do. If we're in the middle of getting ready to do something really important, all of a sudden you stop doing that because this is priority. Can everyone accept that? Will your manager and management support that? Will they understand that you have to pivot to handle that? Will your team understand that? So we're getting close to the end, so let's recap. In general, you've got a lot to learn, you've got a lot to do, and a lot to embrace, and the stuff that we're talking about is really focused on that embrace. And so those things that you have to do, you have to set up more servers, you have to write build scripts, you have to set up new multiple databases, you have to write tests, you have to automate tests, you have to automate builds, and all these different things that come with it. You have to do all of those things, which a lot of that, at the very least, is new to you, and you're not used to doing it, and the people around you are not used to it having to be done. There's a lot that you have to do. There's so much. How many people have heard of the tortoise and the hare? I assume most people. Either we're getting tired, and don't worry, we'll end quickly, or people haven't heard of it, so we'll see. Tortoise and the hare. A rabbit, bunny, hare is much faster than a turtle. Turtle is notoriously slow. They have a race. The rabbit gets really cocky, starts dancing around, taking tea breaks, doing whatever it's doing. A tortoise is just chugging along at a turtle's pace, right? Super slow. For embracing CI/CD and trying to get to the things that that are promised to you, you have to be the turtle. It's a long-term approach. It's a long game. You cannot come out of the gate sprinting as fast as you can because you're going to fall flat. You have to understand this is a long-term goal. This takes time, and it takes investment, and it takes energy and effort, all these things. It's a long-term approach. Last time I'll say it, it's the difference between the short-term effects and the long-term effects that make the difference in whether or not you're successful and everyone buying into what those effects are. Last story time, my wife and I are currently working with a trainer. We've got 3 dogs. The trainer promised us training a dog is the exact same as raising a kid, so when we have kids, we'll be ready. With working with the trainer, you start with sit, right? So you have a dog sit, and you kind of build up to that to where it's consistent, and you're doing that inside with no distractions, right? So as training your dog, you're like, oh man, I can do that. That works. Now take your dog outside, where there's squirrels and birds and other dogs, and now try to get your dog to sit. Totally different, right? So the way he explained it was when you add something new to the environment, when you add a distraction, expect your dog to backtrack. Your dog no longer knows how to sit in that environment. Your dog has to relearn how to sit in that environment. But that relearning process is now much quicker than the initial learning process. So as you change something, you have to backtrack, but then you step forward quicker, and you're at a much bigger end result than you were initially. Same idea with CI/CD. When you add something new, you backtrack. It takes time to learn. It takes time to embrace. It takes time to do all those things. But at the end, long term, you get those benefits. So a couple suggestions. This is the last slide, I think. Create a team to lead. Get a few people together that's their job is to go out there and be the innovators, to go out and explore technologies, to do demos, to do POCs. Have that team be able to lead for you. Communicate. Everybody, top to bottom, has to be able to communicate what's going on at all times. In an agile world, things change, but we have to communicate those things. And if we change what we're doing or adapt timelines or deadlines, or whatever you want to call it, we have to communicate those things. Plan your time accordingly. Everything takes time, and it takes probably 15 times more time than you think, especially testing. Lastly, take it one step at a time. I walked into a scenario where we were trying to plan what we were going to do. I was like, oh my gosh, we have to write tests for all these services. We have to create all the pipelines. We have to create all the tests. We have to all these things. And somebody kind of told me, take a step back. Start off with one test. Not even automated. Start off with one test. Then automate that. Then get a pipeline to, when you push code, it automatically runs the test. Then continue the pipeline to deploy that somewhere, probably not production originally. But take it one step at a time. It's really an overwhelming thing, the amount of stuff you have to do and the amount of things you have to learn. If you take that one step at a time, you can chip away at it and start to get value incrementally along the way. So those are the 4 most important suggestions that I have for you. We will stop to do some questions if they're already in the Slack channel. I think we got about 8 minutes left. So I do want to say thank you guys for coming. Again, if you're interested in social media, and also just for my ego, and I don't have any pictures of me presenting. If you want to take a picture and tweet it out, that'd be really cool. I'd appreciate it. Do we have any questions in the Slack channel?
We don't have questions right now, but we have one comment that said it was a great presentation.
Well, I appreciate that, whoever that was. Any questions for anybody that's here in the room? I think I can see most people. All right, well, thank you guys again. I appreciate you being here, and have a good rest of the conference.